So I want you to picture like the most powerful CEO on Earth right now.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. So he controls the largest military. He owns basically the agricultural output of an entire continent. He's got a total monopoly on the waterways. And he essentially owns the literal bodies of his workforce.
Yeah, a complete terrifying monopoly.
Exactly. And now picture a wanted fugitive, a guy with a literal warrant out for his arrest, walking straight into that CEO's boardroom.
Just walking right in.
Just walking in. And he's armed with nothing but a devastating, undeniably verified data leak. I mean, there's no magic here. There are no thunderbolts falling from the sky.
No booming Hollywood soundtrack either.
Right. It is just a man bringing a systemic audit that is so flawless and so structurally devastating that it eventually brings the entire empire crashing into the sea.
Which is wild because it is probably the ultimate confrontation in human history, and yet it is almost entirely misunderstood.
Completely misunderstood. And that is exactly what we are getting into today. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are taking a stack of really intense analytical material focused on a highly specific historical encounter, Surah Al-Qasas, Ayat 31 through 43. And we're looking at it through a lens that completely, strips away the mythology.
Yeah, we have to strip it away. Because if you are like most people, when you hear the story of Moses and Pharaoh, your brain instantly goes to Charlton Heston.
Oh, totally. You picture the classic Hollywood campfire story.
Right, you get the desert courtyard, the flowing robes, and like the supernatural wizard duel where guys are just throwing magic dust at each other.
But we really need to unpack that imagery today, because the text itself is doing something entirely different. It's actually offering this masterclass in civilizational survival.
It really is. I mean, if you remove the centuries of theological sentimentality, right? And you look precisely at the linguistics of the original Arabic text.
As like a piece of sociology.
Exactly. Or political science.
Yeah.
It transforms completely. It is not a story about conjuring tricks. It's a highly sophisticated systems engineering manual.
A systems engineering manual. I love that.
Yeah, it outlines the absolute universal organizational chart of tyranny.
The organizational chart of tyranny. Like, really think about that for a second. We are looking at a clash between verifiable, rational credentials on the side of the whistleblower and just the raw, unverified assertions of an autocratic regime.
And the whole mission of this deep dive today is to hand you, the listener, a diagnostic tool.
Right, a way to actually use this.
Yeah, we want to show you how to spot this universal hardware of oppression that is, frankly, still operating in the background of our political and corporate structures today.
So let's start by completely dismantling that whole magic show illusion. Because in the traditional narrative, Moses, or Musa, as he is named in the specific text, is basically handed a couple of magic tricks to take to Pharaoh.
Right, the classic wooden staff that literally turns into a biological reptile.
Yeah, and the hand that magically glows in the dark like a light bulb.
Which, immediately places the entire narrative in the realm of fantasy for any modern reader.
It makes it really hard to take seriously as a political text.
Exactly. But the analytical framework our sources are using today argues something radically different. The text makes it very clear that Musa isn't given magic. He's given something called Burhan.
Burhan. Okay, and what does that translate to exactly in a socioeconomic context?
So it translates to a verifiable credential, like an undeniable logical proof.
Oh, wow. Not a magic wand.
Not at all. And to really grasp why this distinction is so vital, we have to talk about how language actually works. Specifically, the linguistic reality of idioms.
Right, because translating ancient languages is messy.
It is. The Quran repeatedly describes its own language as Mubin Arabic, which means it is clear, unambiguous, and it was meant to be perfectly understood by the society it was addressing at the time.
And any clear, natural language heavily relies on idioms.
Generously relies on them. Because if you translate an idiom literally across 1,000 years and, 3 different languages, you end up sounding completely absurd.
Give me an example of that.
Well, think about how we use language today. If a financial analyst goes on TV and says, the tech bubble finally burst, and it was a bloodbath on Wall Street.
Right. A literalist from the year 3000 might think we had magical spheres of glass flooding around.
Exactly. And that actual literal physical violence took place on a street corner in New York.
When we obviously know it's just an idiom for a sudden, massive financial loss.
Yeah. And the sources we are working with provide some incredible examples of this from Urdu poetry to illustrate the point. Like in Urdu, there is an idiom about spitting a snake.
Spitting a snake, that sounds like a terrifying fantasy creature.
Right, if you translate it literally into English, it sounds like a monster movie.
But in its cultural context, spitting a snake simply means drawing a firm line in the sand.
Oh, like setting a boundary.
Exactly. You are setting an uncrossable boundary. Another great example is the phrase becoming water. Water.
So a literal translation means a human being just melted into a puddle. It's like a cartoon character. But the actual meaning is that the person was sweating profusely from deep, intense embarrassment.
Okay, so when we apply that understanding of idioms to the Mubin Arabic of this text, what happens to the magic tricks?
The imagery of Musa throwing down his staff and it becoming a snake is not a David Copperfield illusion. It is a deeply powerful political and systemic idiom.
Okay, let's break that idiom down then. Because if I am the listener trying to map this onto a modern power dynamic, what does the staff represent here?
Well, in an agrarian or pastoral society, a staff is the ultimate symbol of authority and management.
Like a shepherd's crook.
Yeah, it represents the capacity to shepherd, to support oneself, but also, critically, the capacity to strike.
So it's the tangible instrument of a person's policy or system.
Exactly. Now, what is a snake? A snake is a venomous, hidden threat. It represents an overarching lethal danger that can strike right at the heart of a living organism.
So when the text says Musa's staff becomes a snake that swallows the illusions of the regime, we aren't talking about a magical terrarium.
Not at all. We are talking about a systemic argument. Musa is presenting a verifiable truth, his burhan, that completely consumes and neutralizes the venomous, toxic policies of Pharaoh's state.
It's an intellectual and socioeconomic argument?
Yes, one that is so ironclad, it just swallows the propaganda of the regime whole.
Wait, I need to push back on this a little bit because I want to make sure we aren't just, sanitizing a myth to make it sound modern and palatable.
Sure, go ahead.
If Musa is just bringing a really sharp systemic audit, like a flawless spreadsheet of Pharaoh's human rights abuses and economic corruption, why use the snake imagery at all?
That's a fair question.
Because why wrap a political argument in the imagery of a terrifying, venomous reptile? It feels excessively aggressive for what amounts to a civil rights debate.
Well, because it wasn't just a debate. And to understand the imagery, you have to understand the sheer macroeconomic terror of the situation on the ground.
Set the scene for us.
Musa isn't stepping up to a podium at some polite university symposium. He is walking right into the epicenter of a global superpower. This is a regime that has structurally enslaved an entire demographic, the Israelites, specifically to build its wealth.
And furthermore, Musa is a wanted man.
Exactly. He had accidentally killed an Egyptian years prior and fled into exile.
He's basically a proclaimed offender returning to the exact jurisdiction that wants him dead.
Precisely. And the text openly acknowledges that when Musa is tasked with this mission, he is afraid.
Which is a completely human reaction.
Yeah, and he isn't afraid of a piece of wood suddenly growing fangs. He is experiencing the deeply rational, psychological terror of a marginalized, wanted fugitive walking into the jaws of a heavily militarized surveillance state apparatus.
Okay, that makes so much sense. Challenging a superpower of that magnitude requires you to demonstrate that you can survive and swallow their venomous policies.
You have to prove that your counter-narrative, your systemic credential, is literally more lethal to their lies than their secret police are to your body.
Wow. That reframes the entire power dynamic for me. The imagery of the snake isn't about magic at all. It's about the lethal stakes of challenging a monopoly.
Exactly. If you are going to take on a trillion-dollar corporate state, your argument better have fangs.
It better have fangs. I love that because Pharaoh's entire system relies on the illusion that he owns everything. He claims the rivers, the agricultural output, the people.
And Musa is offering checkable, systemic signs that the productive forces Pharaoh claims to own actually belong to the people and to a universal law of justice.
Which brings us to the second credential, the white hand. Because usually in the movies, this is depicted as Musa pulling his hand out of his cloak and it's glowing like a radioactive light bulb.
Yeah, like a special effect.
What is the systemic translation of the white hand?
So a white hand or a clean hand is another brilliant idiom. Think about the English phrase, caught red-handed.
Meaning caught with the blood of the crime literally on your hands.
Right. A white, clean hand represents the exact opposite of that. It means bringing forth a track record that is completely unblemished, totally free of corruption or ulterior motives.
It is an impeccable credential.
Yes. Musa is stepping into the most corrupt court in the world as a whistleblower with undeniable, clean evidence. He's basically saying, my hands are clean, My record is clear, and my argument will dismantle your systemic toxicity.
It's the ultimate audit. And what is so fascinating about this approach is that it requires us to look at Pharaoh's regime not as a single guy in a gold hat yelling at slaves, but as a complex corporation.
Well, a very complex corporate structure.
Because if Musa is auditing the system, we need to understand the architecture of the system he is auditing. And the source material provides this phenomenal breakdown of the organizational chart of tyranny.
This is where the text transitions from historical narrative to pure political science. Because tyranny is never just one man. It is a highly structured corporate entity.
And the text explicitly names 3 distinct departments operating within the structure.
Yes, it identifies a triad of power. The first, obviously, is Pharaoh. But in this framework, Pharaoh isn't just a historical king.
What does he represent?
He represents the department of raw, coercive power and massive capital accumulation. He's the CEO of coercion.
The CEO of coercion?
Yeah, he holds the monopoly on state violence and the distribution of resources.
But, I mean, a CEO cannot manage millions of subjugated people by himself. He can't be everywhere at once.
Exactly. Brute force is incredibly expensive, and it causes massive societal friction. You can't just beat everyone all the time. So the CEO needs a board of directors.
And that brings us to the second department, which the text calls the mala. Let's dig into that, because I think anyone who has ever worked in a massive corporation or watched modern politics will instantly recognize this group.
Oh, absolutely. The mala is the inner council. There are the vested interest elite, the high-level bureaucrats, the sycophants, the cabinet members.
And what is their primary function in the system?
Their primary function is insulation. They surround the CEO of coercion, and they form a buffer zone.
Insulation from what? From the public?
From reality itself.
Oh.
The Mullahs ensures that the cries of the oppressed never reach the ears of the powerful.
Because they benefit financially from the monopoly.
Exactly. So their job is to nod in agreement, to echo the tyrant's absurd assertions, and to manufacture this illusion of consensus.
So when Pharaoh says something completely disconnected from reality, the mullah says, yes, absolutely, brilliant strategy, sir.
Exactly. They demand unquestioning obedience from the lower tiers of the hierarchy, acting as the enforcers of the CEO's will. But always with a veneer of administrative process.
It's the classic echo chamber. You have the dictator, and you have the oligarchs who profit off him. But if you just have violence and yes men, the public is eventually going to revolt. The math just doesn't work long term.
No, you can't keep millions of people in chains just through sheer terror forever.
Right, there has to be a mechanism for psychological control. Which brings us to the third piece of the triad.
And this is arguably the most dangerous department of all. It is named Haman.
Now, the analysis makes a crucial point here, right? Haman isn't just a historical guy who happened to be standing next to the throne.
No, Haman represents a permanent department in the architecture of tyranny. Haman is the system's chief architect and the head of propaganda.
The head of propaganda.
He is the high priest of legitimacy theater.
Legitimacy theater. That phrase alone is worth the price of admission today. So Haman is the PR department.
Exactly. His entire job is to manufacture the illusion that the oppressive system is actually beneficial, or at least, inevitable.
Wow.
The text uses a very specific word for oppression, zulm. It literally means putting things in the wrong place, creating systemic imbalance.
Like taking wealth that belongs to the workers and putting it in the pockets of the elite.
Right, or taking freedom that belongs to the individual and putting it under the control of the state. To maintain zulm, you need the population to willingly participate in their own subjugation.
You need them to believe the system is the only possible reality.
That is Haman's job. He engineers the religious, cultural, or ideological justifications for Pharaoh's raw power.
So when Musa walks into that boardroom, he isn't just challenging a monarch, he is delivering an indictment to the entire corporation.
He is walking in and saying, your CEO is corrupt, your board of directors is illegitimate, and your PR department is systematically lying about your balance sheets.
And he backs it all up with the Burhan. He demands an intellectual and factual reckoning.
Yes.
Which brings us to a really incredible collision. What happens when the engine of reason, Musa's verifiable proof, crashes into the tyranny of unproven assertions?
Because if we look at the baseline of Pharaoh's argument, his entire regime is built on air, isn't it?
Totally baseless.
The text zones in on verse 28.38 to illustrate this dynamic. Pharaoh makes this grand, sweeping claim to his inner council, the Mullah.
What does he say?
He says, I am your highest lord. I know of no God for you besides me.
Okay, so if we strip away the theological baggage that usually accompanies that translation, what is he actually asserting in a socioeconomic sense?
He is claiming absolute, unchecked sovereignty. He is saying, I am the ultimate authority over the means of production, the distribution of resources, and the law itself.
So he's saying there is no objective standard of justice above his personal will.
Exactly. He claims to be the Rab, the sustainer. He claims that he provides the daily bread, that he owns the water of the Nile. But it is an entirely unverifiable assertion.
There is no proof that he intrinsically owns the labor of the Israelites.
None. It is an assertion maintained solely by the violence of the state, the agreement of the mullah, and the propaganda of a man.
He's basically saying, I am the market, I am the state, I am the truth.
Right.
And against this massive echoing chamber of state-sponsored fiction, Musa introduces something terrifying to a dictator, a factual audit.
A factual audit, yeah.
He says, essentially, let's look at the reality on the ground. Your system is built on the systemic robbery of my people. The resources you claim to own actually belong to a higher, objective law of human equity.
Musa challenges the core premise of the monopoly. He doesn't ask for a bigger slice of the pie for his people. He questions Pharaoh's right to own the bakery.
And here's where we see what I like to call the spectacle reflex. This is one of the most profound insights from our source material.
The spectacle reflex. Explain that.
Well, think about how a normal person or a healthy system responds to a logical challenge. If someone brings you a spreadsheet showing your math is wrong, what do?
You pull out your own spreadsheet, you debate the data.
Exactly. But when Musa challenges the regime with undeniable logic, Pharaoh doesn't answer the argument. He doesn't produce data. He completely pivots.
He turns to his propaganda chief, Haman, and he issues a bizarre order.
Right. He says, build me a tower.
The text calls it a sar, a lofty tower. And you are right, this is one of the most brilliant systems analyses in the entire narrative.
Because when a power structure cannot answer an intellectual or moral argument, it builds a spectacle.
Pharaoh literally says, build me a tower so I can look for the God of Musa. I mean, it's almost comical.
It is comical. What is he doing? He knows there isn't a physical guy sitting on a cloud that he can see from a brick tower.
It is entirely cynical. He knows it's absurd, but the act of building it is the point. We have to analyze the systemic function of this tower.
Okay, let's break that down.
Musa has just exposed the logical void at the center of the state. He has humiliated the narrative of the regime in front of the inner council.
So Pharaoh needs to immediately reassert dominance.
But he cannot do it intellectually because he has no Burhan. So he commands his chief architect to initiate a colossal public works project.
It's misdirection. It's the ultimate magician's trick played out on a macroeconomic scale.
It is a massive propaganda capital expenditure. It converts the public treasury into the appearance of authority, specifically because the actual substance of authority is missing.
Wow. Let's look at what building a massive tower actually does to a society.
First, it keeps the working class exhausted and distracted. You are diverting their labor into a massive, highly visible project.
And second, it keeps the elite busy managing the logistics, and skimming off the top of the contracts.
Exactly. And third, it dominates the visual landscape. The tower is the ultimate piece of legitimacy theater.
Because when a citizen walks out of their house and looks up at a monument that blocks out the sun, their brain struggles to hold on to the nuanced, logical argument of the whistleblower.
Scale bypasses the prefrontal cortex, where logic happens, and appeals directly to the human vulnerability to awe and intimidation.
The physical monument makes the individual citizen feel small. And feeling physically small translates neurologically to feeling politically powerless.
Think about the modern equivalence of this, because once you see the tower, you see it everywhere.
Oh, this is the ultimate tell of a failing system. Like when a regime replaces open debate with highly produced, massive media spectacles.
Or when a failing tech monopoly, whose core product is actively harming society, suddenly spends $3 billion building a spaceship-shaped glass headquarters while simultaneously laying off thousands of workers.
Yes. Or when an autocratic state with a collapsing economy decides to build the world's tallest flagpole or an empty megacity in the desert.
That is the tower.
It means the system is fundamentally bankrupt of ideas and is trying to flood the zone with concrete instead of logic.
Flooding the zone with concrete. That is exactly what Haman's department does. If you cannot be right, be loud. If you cannot be just, be enormous.
And the source material points out that this is where the so-called magicians fit into the narrative, right?
Yes, because usually we picture Pharaoh summoning warlocks to turn their canes into snakes to fight Musa's snake.
But if we apply our linguistic framework, these weren't warlocks.
The text calls them as Sahara. In this context, these are the PR operatives. They are the spin doctors, the propagandists, the highly paid consultants whose entire job is to create illusions that support the state's narrative.
So when Musa brings his Burhan, he isn't fighting a magical duel. He is going up against the state media apparatus.
It's going up against the algorithm.
He really is.
And the narrative shows a remarkable moment of clarity here. When Musa presents the unvarnished, undeniable truth, when his systemic critique, his snake, swallows their illusions, the propagandists themselves recognize it.
Because they are experts in manipulation, so they know a trick when they see one.
Exactly. But they look at Musa's argument, and they realize it is rooted in fundamental reality. The text says they immediately submitted to the truth. They folded.
So let's track the timeline here. Musa brings the audit. The state's PR operatives try to spin it, but the audit is so bulletproof that the spin doctors actually admit defeat and quit.
Right.
So Pharaoh, realizing he has lost the intellectual war and his PR department has basically collapsed, immediately orders Haman to build a giant distraction tower to keep the public hypnotized.
It is so deeply cynical. But as a defense mechanism for a tyrant, it's structurally sound.
It's structurally sound in the short term, but it leads to a very specific psychological rot within the regime.
Yes, and to understand that rot, we need to look at another specific word the text uses to describe Pharaoh and his inner council's reaction.
What's the word?
The word is istakbara, found in verse 28.39.
Istakbara. Now, normally if you look at a standard translation, this just gets translated as pride or arrogance. It makes it sound like Pharaoh just had an inflated ego.
Like he was just a narcissist who couldn't handle being corrected.
Right. But our sources urge us to drill much deeper into the systemic meaning of that word.
Istakbara is not merely personal vanity. It is a highly specific condition. Institutional arrogance.
How does the analysis define institutional arrogance? What does that actually look like in practice?
Institutional arrogance is the systemic, deliberate refusal to process evidence on its merits.
Because accepting the truth would be dangerous to them.
Exactly. Because accepting the truth would require dismantling the institution's own power structure. Let me break that down.
Please do.
Pharaoh and his Mazar aren't ignoring Musa because they don't understand his logic. They understand it perfectly.
But they realize that if they accept his Burhan, if they can see that the resources belong to the people, that human beings are fundamentally equal, and that the state cannot play God, their entire monopoly dissolves.
They lose their wealth, they lose their immunity, and they likely go to jail or worse.
So istakbara is really a self-preservation mechanism.
Yes. It's the institution deciding that its own survival, its own profit margin, is more important than objective reality.
Think of a massive fossil fuel company in the 1970s internally discovering that their product is causing catastrophic climate change.
That's a perfect example. Instead of processing that reality and changing their business model, what do?
They bury the research and spend millions lobbying to change environmental regulations. They decide reality is inconvenient to the shareholders.
That is literal istakbara.
And what's fascinating and honestly a bit terrifying is the progression that follows. Once an institution locks into istakbara, once it decides to actively wage war on reality, it enters a very dangerous psychological phase.
The sources point out a profound truth about human behavior here. When a regime runs out of logic, it inevitably resorts to mockery.
The text calls it istiza derision.
Because if you can't fight the facts, you have to destroy the messenger.
Right. Musa says, your system is mathematically and morally bankrupt. Pharaoh doesn't say, let me show you our economic projections. He laughs. He mocks.
He looks at his mullah and says, who is this guy? A runaway fugitive, a shepherd who can't even speak eloquently. He attacks Musa's status.
The mockery is a tactic. It is designed to humiliate the auditor so that the audience ignores the audit.
But it also serves a secondary internal function for the elites. Mockery is an intoxicant.
An intoxicant? How so?
The elites sit in their insulated chambers, laughing at the whistleblower, drinking the wine of their own power, completely insulated from the structural damage they're causing outside the palace walls.
And the Mala reinforces it. They laugh along with the CEO.
They get high on their own supply propaganda.
They absolutely do. And that intoxication blinds them to the inevitable consequences of their actions.
Which brings us to the devastating verdict pronounced in verse 28.41.
Okay, what does the text state here?
The text states that because of this institutional arrogance, this istakbara, the regime is transformed into ayima yaduna ila al-nar.
Translating to, leaders who call people to the fire.
Yes. Now, traditionally, this is where the interpretation becomes very mystical. It's usually read as these bad leaders taking people to a literal, metaphorical hell in the afterlife.
But if we stick to our socioeconomic framework, what is the immediate real-world reality the text is pointing to? What is the fire?
The fire is civilizational collapse. It's the burning down of society.
Wow.
They aren't leading people to a metaphorical hell in another dimension. They are engineering hell on Earth.
Let's look at the math of what they're actually doing.
By monopolizing resources,
Yeah.
by structurally oppressing the working class, by replacing genuine policy debates with multi-billion-dollar legitimacy theaters.
And by insulating themselves in echo chambers of mockery.
Right. These leaders are writing the code for their own destruction. They're
Yeah.
bleeding the system dry.
They are piloting the airplane directly into the ground, and instead of pulling up, they are demanding the passengers admire the new paint job on the wings.
That is a perfect analogy. They are calling their society to the fire of revolution, economic ruin, and structural collapse.
The fire isn't an arbitrary punishment. It is the logical outcome of zulm, of systemic imbalance.
Which brings us directly to the climax of the narrative, because we know how the story of Moses and Pharaoh ends.
Right, it's the most famous cinematic moment in history. The parting of the sea, the Israelites escaping, and the waters crashing down to drown the Egyptian army.
So, if we are reading this as a political science textbook and not a magic show, what does the drowning actually mean?
How do we understand this within a systems engineering framework?
We have to reframe the drowning entirely through the concept of mukafat amal.
Mukafat iyama, let's define that for the listener.
It translates roughly to the law of requital, or the universal law of cause and effect. It is societal physics.
Societal physics.
Verse 28.40 says, "We seized him and his forces and flung them into the sea."
And the source material insists that we shouldn't read this as a magical flood summoned out of thin air by a wizard.
Exactly. It is the ultimate manifestation of cause and effect. It is the inevitable closure of a self-doomed system.
So it's not magic, it's physics.
It is the physics of human civilization. Let's look at the structural integrity of Pharaoh's state at this point in the narrative.
Okay, let's assess the bridge, so to speak.
A regime that relies on zulm displacing justice, putting wealth and power in the wrong hands, has fundamentally compromised its own architecture.
Think of it like building a bridge with corrupted cheap steel, but painting it gold so it looks beautiful.
Exactly. Pharaoh's state converted its entire population into managed, oppressed factions. It blew its treasury on the Sar, the massive tower of distraction.
And it disabled its own intelligence gathering by surrounding the CEO with a mala of yes-men who only told him what he wanted to hear.
It completely hollowed itself out. It looked strong on the outside because of the military and the towers, but structurally, it was incredibly fragile.
It had absolutely zero structural resilience.
So when an actual historical, economic, or environmental pressure event occurs, which is represented in the text by the sea, the system cannot adapt.
The gold paint doesn't hold the bridge up when the hurricane hits.
The system shatters completely. The drowning is not an arbitrary lightning bolt from the sky. It is the mathematical result of the equation Pharaoh and Haman wrote themselves.
The sea is just the executioner of the math.
I love that. The executioner of the math.
But wait, let me push back on this idea of inevitable collapse. Because if we look at history, or even the modern world, some incredibly oppressive regimes last for a very, very long time.
That's true. They can seem practically invincible.
Right. So if we are saying this is an ironclad law of societal physics, couldn't a system like that course correct? If they see the literal sea of economic collapse or revolution coming, can't the CEO just turn the ship around?
That is the brilliant, terrifying question at the heart of this analysis. And the source answers it by returning to the psychology of istakbara.
The institutional arrogance.
It compares the architects of such a regime to a drunkard. They are literally intoxicated by power. Remember, a system that runs entirely on institutional arrogance systematically disables its own feedback loops.
What do you mean by feedback loops in a socioeconomic sense?
Think about how pain functions in the human body. Pain is an essential feedback loop. If you accidentally put your hand on a hot stove, your nervous system sends a jolt of pain to your brain, and you pull your hand away.
The pain saves you from losing your hand.
But a system intoxicated by power, insulated by a mala, cannot feel the pain it causes to its own population.
Ah, the mala acts as a societal anesthetic.
Exactly. The working class is starting, the infrastructure is crumbling, but the board of directors tells the CEO everything is fine, the GDP is up, the people love the new tower.
So because the feedback loop is severed, the brain of the state literally doesn't know the hand is burning.
Because they cannot feel the pain, they cannot course correct. They walk blindly toward the cliff.
The sea swallows them specifically because they structurally eliminated their ability to see the danger.
They were too busy mocking the whistleblowers, laughing in their echo chambers, to notice the water rising around their ankles.
That is terrifyingly logical. They drown because they engineered their own blindness.
They built a system so rigid, so dependent on lies, and so insulated from reality that when a real-world stress test finally hit, it didn't just bend, it snapped completely.
It is the ultimate requital. The system's perceived strength, its absolute unbending coercive power, becomes the exact mechanism of its doom.
A flexible system, one that allows for feedback, processes the Burhan, and adapts to reality, survives.
But a rigid system that builds towers of denial ends up at the bottom of the sea.
Okay, let's take a breath because we have covered massive ground here.
We really have. We are moving into the final synthesis of this deep dive. Because what we've done over the last hour is take a story that most of us learned in childhood as a fairy tale about a magic staff.
And we have reconstructed it into a rigorous, universally applicable political science textbook.
And if I'm tracking with you and our source material, the absolute genius of Surah Al-Qasas is how it separates the permanent hardware of human history from the variable software.
That is the perfect conceptual framework to take away from this. The text isn't telling a campfire story about antiquity, just to entertain us with historical trivia.
It is providing a timeless diagnostic tool for human civilization.
It is deliberately separating what changes from what remains eternal.
Let's define the variable software, the change.
The variable software are the specific details of the era, the specific royal title, pharaoh, the historical individual who held the office of Haman in that specific century.
The physical, literal brick tower built in the Egyptian desert.
The geopolitical boundaries of the Nile Valley, the fact that the transportation was chariots instead of armored SUVs.
These are all temporary variables. They change with every century, with every new empire.
Right, you update the software. Instead of a guy named Haman carving hieroglyphics into sandstone, you have a massive PR firm running bot networks on social media.
Instead of a guy with a whip managing slaves building a pyramid, you have a middle manager enforcing an algorithm that tracks warehouse workers' bathroom breaks down to the second.
The technology changes, the aesthetics change.
The software updates, yes, but the hardware, the underlying architecture of the system, is completely permanent.
That is the universal lesson of the text. The alliance of raw, coercive power pharaoh, an insulated elite council that profits from the monopoly, the Mala.
And a propaganda department that manufactures legitimacy, Haman.
That is the universal hardware of tyranny.
The org chart is eternal.
The org chart is eternal. Whenever a power structure runs out of rational arguments, it will reflexively build a tower.
It will create spectacle to mask its lack of substance.
It will engage in istakbara, institutional arrogance, and mock the whistleblowers who bring the Burhan.
The text explicitly names the departments of every pharaonic state that has ever existed and every one that ever will exist.
So as we wrap this up, what does this all mean for you, the listener?
How do you take this intense systems-level analysis from a 7th century text and actually apply it to your life today?
Well, if you internalize this framework, it completely changes the way you consume the news.
It changes the way you view political structures, your workplace, and corporate monopolies.
Once you know what the tower is, you start seeing legitimacy theater everywhere you look.
You really do. You stop getting distracted by the spectacle. When a massive corporation that is facing a devastating environmental audit suddenly launches a multi-million-dollar, highly emotional ad campaign about how much they love planting trees,
You recognize it instantly. That's Haman, that's the tower.
they are building a spectacle because they cannot answer the burhan, the verifiable evidence of their pollution.
When a political leader refuses to debate actual policy, refuses to answer questions about the economy, and instead holds massive, highly produced rallies where they just mock their opponents.
You recognize the istiza, the mockery, you see the istakbara, the institutional arrogance that refuses to process reality.
You realize you aren't looking at a display of strength. You are looking at the structural brittleness of a system that has severed its feedback loops and is terrified of an audit.
And, perhaps most importantly, you realize that the whistleblowers, the people bringing the burhan today, often look exactly like Musa.
They are marginalized. They might not have the polished, focus-grouped language of the Mullah.
They might seem afraid because challenging a superpower or a multi-billion-dollar monopoly is objectively terrifying.
But they carry the staff that can swallow the venom. They carry the clean hand of verifiable truth.
This has been an absolutely mind-bending journey. We started with a broken Hollywood X-ray machine and a magic show, and we ended up with a masterclass in structural engineering and civilizational survival.
But before we sign off, we want to leave you with one final provocative thought.
Something to chew on while you were driving or washing the dishes after this deep dive is over.
If the core premise of this text holds true, if every tyrannical system, every architecture of arrogance, has a built-in self-destruct sequence based on the law of requital,
And if the sea represents the inevitable structural collapse that swallows those rigid, blind systems.
what is the modern equivalent of the sea?
Oh, man. That is heavy.
Think about it. What is the inevitable reality that our current global architectures of arrogance are blindly walking into today while they're intoxicated by their own power?
Laughing in their echo chambers and busy building their modern glass towers.
Is the sea waiting for them ecological? Is it the collapse of the biosphere?
Is it an economic sea of hyperinflation and unpayable debt?
Is it a technological sea, where the algorithms they built to control us end up dismantling the society that sustains them?
Because the hardware of tyranny hasn't changed, and the universal law of cause and effect hasn't been repealed.
The sea is out there. It's always out there.
And the towers are getting taller every single day. That is a chilling but incredibly clarifying thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope this framework gives you a sharp new lens to look at the world around you.
To spot the towers of legitimacy theater, and to always, always demand the burhan. Stay curious, keep your hands clean, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.